The first time Callum Dawson saw the woman with the broken fence, she was standing on her porch, hands on her hips, glaring at the damage like it had personally offended her. He wiped the sweat from his brow, adjusting his grip on his toolbox as he stepped closer. "Need some help?" The woman turned, her striking brown eyes locking onto him. "Only if you know how to fix a fence that's determined to collapse every time the wind blows." Callum let out a low chuckle. "Lucky for you I do." She studied him for a moment before sighing. "Fine, I'm Juliette." "Juliette Monroe." "Callum Dawson," he said, offering his hand. She shook it, her grip firm. He liked that. Callum had spent the last 5 years rebuilding his life after his ex walked out, leaving him to raise their son, Ryder, alone. He worked construction during the day, coached Ryder's little league team in the evenings, and did odd jobs around town when he had the time. He wasn't looking for anything especially, not with a woman who looked like she belonged in a designer magazine rather than in their quiet little town. But a job was a job. "So what happened here?" he asked, crouching to examine the damage. The wooden panels were barely hanging on, some snapped clean in half. Juliette sighed. "Storm took it out last week. I tried hiring someone, but the contractors around here are booked for months." "You're in luck then. I can get this patched up for you." Her lips twitched. "Should I be concerned that the only available handyman is a guy I just met on my porch?" Callum grinned. "Only if you don't like quality work." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Mr. Quality Work, how much?" He named a price, fair but lower than what the contractors would have charged. She didn't even blink before agreeing. As he got to work, Juliette lingered nearby, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You from around here?" he asked, driving a nail into place. "Moved in a few months ago," she said. "Needed a change." Callum nodded. He knew all about needing a fresh start. By the time Ryder ran up the driveway, covered in dirt from playing baseball, Callum had half the fence stabilized. "Dad, you promised we'd go to the diner after practice," Ryder reminded him. Callum sighed. "Right, you hungry?" Ryder grinned. "Always." Juliette tilted her head. "You two go to Rosie's." Callum raised an eyebrow. "You know Rosie's?" Juliette smirked. "Of course, I may be new, but I'm not clueless. They make the best burgers in town." Ryder lit up. "Do you want to come with us?" Callum started to shake his head, but Juliette surprised him by saying, "Why not?" So that was how Callum found himself sitting across from Juliette Monroe in a tiny diner, watching Ryder tell her all about his baseball team. She listened intently, laughing at his jokes, asking all the right questions. Callum wasn't sure what to make of her. She didn't seem like the kind of woman who'd just moved to a small town for no reason, and there was something in her eyes, something guarded. Still, when she smiled at Ryder like he was the most interesting person in the world, Callum felt something he hadn't in a long time. Interest. Maybe this fence job was more than just another repair. Maybe Juliette Monroe was someone worth getting to know. Callum hadn't planned on spending his evening sitting across from Juliette Monroe in a booth at Rosie's, watching his son charm her with tales of baseball victories and disastrous school projects. Yet there he was, leaning back against the worn leather seat, arms crossed as he studied her. She wasn't what he'd expected. From the moment he'd stepped onto her porch earlier that day, he'd pegged her as someone passing through a woman who didn't plan to stay long in a town like theirs. But she listened to Ryder like she actually cared, laughing in all the right places, nodding along like she had all the time in the world. "So, what made you pick this town?" Callum asked, breaking his silence as the waitress set down their food. Juliette hesitated, reaching for her burger as if the answer was buried somewhere in the sesame seeds. "I needed a reset," she said finally, "somewhere quiet." Callum arched a brow. "Quiet's one word for it." She huffed out a laugh. "What would you call it?" "Predictable," he admitted. "People don't come here unless they're looking for something specific." Juliette's gaze flickered to Ryder, who was too busy inhaling his fries to notice. "Or unless they're looking to get away from something." Callum didn't push. He knew that tone. He'd used it himself when people pried into his life after his ex left. Some things weren't meant to be shared over burgers and fries. Instead, he turned his attention back to Ryder, who had just finished telling Juliette about the time he'd accidentally hit a baseball through their neighbor's window. I thought Dad was gonna lose it, Ryder said between bites. But then Mr. Hendricks said it was the most excitement he'd had in years. Juliette grinned. Sounds like your dad's a pretty patient guy, Callum snorted. That's one way of putting it. Ryder beamed, clearly pleased with the compliment. As the meal went on, Callum found himself watching Juliette more than he meant to. There was something about the way she carried herself poised but not distant. And when she laughed, it wasn't the polite kind he was used to hearing from people who didn't really want to be there. It was real. By the time they left the diner, the sky was dark, the air cool against their skin. I'll finish the fence tomorrow, Callum said as they walked to their cars. Juliette nodded. I appreciate it. Ryder yawned, rubbing his eyes as he climbed into the truck. Callum turned back to Juliette. You need anything else fixed around the house? She studied him for a beat, then shook her head. Not unless you moonlight as an interior designer. He huffed out a chuckle. Afraid not. Juliette tilted her head, something unreadable in her expression. See you tomorrow then. As Callum drove home, Ryder dozed off in the passenger seat, his head resting against the window. Callum exhaled, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Juliette Monroe was a mystery, and mysteries had a way of making a man curious. The next morning, Callum arrived at Juliette's house with a fresh cup of coffee in hand, ready to finish the fence. He wasn't expecting to find her already outside, her hair pulled back, a look of determination on her face. You're up early, he noted, setting his toolbox down. Juliette crossed her arms. Figured I'd see how the magic happens. Callum huffed a laugh. It's not magic, just experience. She tilted her head. Same thing, isn't it? Callum shook his head, pulling off his jacket as he got to work. Juliette didn't hover this time. Instead, she leaned against the porch railing, watching in quiet curiosity. After a while, she cleared her throat. Ryder's a great kid. Callum didn't look up, but he could hear the sincerity in her voice. Yeah, he is. She hesitated before continuing. It can't be easy raising him on your own. Callum paused, gripping the wood a little tighter. It has its moments. Juliette studied him. Is his mom still in the picture? Callum exhaled. Not really. She left when he was 4. Said she wasn't cut out for it. Juliette's expression softened, but she didn't offer empty sympathy. Instead, she nodded. Sounds like you stepped up. Callum glanced at her. Didn't have a choice. She smiled faintly. You could have given up. Plenty of people would have. Callum didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to people acknowledging that part of his life, at least not in a way that felt genuine. Juliette shifted her weight. My mother always said people show you who they are when things get tough. Callum arched a brow. Sounds like she was a smart woman. Juliette's lips pressed together. She was. Callum caught the past tense but didn't push. He figured everyone had their own ghosts. By the time the fence was finished, the sun was high, and Juliette had disappeared inside, only to return with 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed him one, settling onto the porch steps beside him. Looks good, she admitted, nodding toward the fence. Callum took a sip of his drink. Should hold up for a while. She tapped her fingers against the glass. You ever think about doing more than just construction? Callum raised a brow. Like what? She shrugged. Starting your own company, something bigger. Callum let out a low chuckle. Takes money to start something like that. Juliette glanced away. Money's not everything. Callum shook his head. It helps, though. She didn't argue, but something in her expression shifted, like she knew exactly what money could and couldn't do. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Juliette turned to him. You should come by for dinner sometime. Callum blinked. Dinner, she nodded. Consider it a thank you for the fence. Callum studied her. There was something in her tone, something more than just gratitude. Then, before he could respond, Ryder came running up the driveway, waving excitedly. Dad, Coach said I get to pitch at the next game. Callum grinned. That's great, kid. Juliette's eyes lit up. You're the pitcher now. Ryder nodded enthusiastically. Coach says I've got a good arm. Juliette leaned forward. I'd love to see you play. Ryder's face brightened. You should come. Callum opened his mouth to interject, but Juliette was already nodding. I'd like that. Callum exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. This woman was full of surprises, and against his better judgment, he found himself looking forward to the next time he'd see her. Callum stood at the edge of the baseball field, arms crossed, watching Ryder wind up for his pitch. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue across the neatly lined diamond, the sound of cheering parents and the crack of bats filling the air. He could feel the usual tension in his chest, the mix of pride and nervous energy that came with watching his son play. But today, something was different. Juliette was there. She sat a few rows up in the bleachers, her focus entirely on Ryder as he hurled the ball toward the batter. When the sharp thwack of the ball hitting the catcher's mitt echoed through the field, she clapped, her enthusiasm genuine. Callum hadn't expected her to actually show up. People said things all the time, made promises they didn't keep, but she had. And for reasons he couldn't quite put his finger on, that meant something. After the game, Ryder came bounding toward them, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Did you see that last strikeout?" he asked, practically bouncing on his heels. Juliette grinned. "Sure did, you've got a serious arm." Ryder beamed, then turned to Callum. "Coach says I might start pitching more." Callum tousled his hair. "You earned it." Juliette glanced between them. "I think this calls for a celebration." Ryder's eyes widened. "Like ice cream," Juliette laughed. "Exactly like ice cream." Callum hesitated. He hadn't planned on extending the evening, but the hopeful look on Ryder's face made it impossible to say no. They ended up at a small ice cream shop near the town square, Ryder practically pressing his face against the glass as he picked his flavor. Callum stood next to Juliette, hands in his pockets, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. "You didn't have to come today," he said. Juliette shrugged. "I wanted to." Callum studied her. "Why?" She turned to face him fully. "Because I like being here." He wasn't sure what to make of that. People didn't just like being in a town like theirs unless they were running from something. Before he could press further, Ryder returned with a towering cone of chocolate ice cream, already licking at the melting edges. They found a bench outside, the town square glowing with soft lamplight as the evening settled in. Ryder was too busy with his dessert to notice the way Callum and Juliette kept stealing glances at each other. After a while, she set her empty cup aside and leaned back slightly. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Callum exhaled, considering the question. "Not really." "This town's home." Juliette tapped her fingers against the bench. "I used to think home was a place. Turns out it's more about the people." Callum looked at her, really looked at her. There was something in her voice, something wistful. "You left somewhere, didn't you?" he asked. Juliette gave a small nod. "Yeah, and for a while I thought that was what I wanted, but the more time I spend here, the more I realize I was looking for something I didn't even know I needed." Callum didn't ask what that was. He had a feeling she wasn't ready to say. Instead, he let the silence sit between them, comfortable and unspoken. Ryder yawned, his head tilting slightly against Callum's arm. Juliette smiled softly. "Looks like someone's ready to call it a night." Callum glanced down at his son, then back at her. "Yeah." "It's getting late." They walked back to their cars together, Ryder sleepily trailing beside them. Before she got into her car, Juliette hesitated. "Callum," he met her gaze. "Yeah," she seemed to search for the right words. "Thanks for letting me be a part of today." Callum nodded, something tightening in his chest. "Anytime." As she drove off, he stood there for a moment, watching her taillights disappear into the night. He had a feeling Juliette Monroe was about to change everything. Callum wasn't sure when it happened, when Juliette Monroe became more than just a woman who needed a fence fixed. Maybe it was the way she showed up, not just for Ryder's game but for the little moments in between. Maybe it was the quiet way she listened, not pushing, not prying, but somehow always knowing when to be there. Days passed, and Juliette kept finding her way into his life. She dropped by the baseball field during practice, bringing an extra water bottle for Ryder. She'd wave at Callum when she passed by his construction site in town. And when he finally accepted her dinner invitation, he found himself sitting at her kitchen table, watching her move around the stove with that same quiet confidence she carried everywhere. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. One evening, after Ryder had fallen asleep on the couch at Juliette's house, Callum found himself standing beside her on the porch, the hum of summer insects filling the silence. "You're good with him," he said, watching the way her gaze softened when she looked at Ryder. Juliette leaned against the railing. "He's easy to love." Callum exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You don't have to keep doing all this, showing up. Being around. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. Do you want me to stop? Callum hesitated. That was the problem. He didn't. Juliette studied him for a moment before looking away. I spent most of my life surrounded by people who only cared about what I could offer them. Money, connections, status. Here with you and Ryder, it's different, it's real. Callum frowned, something clicking into place. Juliette, what exactly did you leave behind? She let out a slow breath. The life I was born into, my family, my name, it comes with expectations. And for a long time, I played the part. I went to the right schools, attended the right events, smiled when I was supposed to, but I wanted more than that. I wanted to be more than my last name. Callum didn't know what to say. He wasn't a man who cared about wealth or status, but he wasn't blind to what it meant. If Juliette had walked away from that kind of life, she must have had her reasons. So you left it all behind, he asked. She nodded. Moved here, bought the house. Tried to build something for myself without my family's influence. Callum leaned against the railing beside her. And have they come looking for you? Juliette gave a small, almost tired laugh. Of course. They don't understand why I'd trade their world for this one. Callum studied her, something in his chest tightening. And why did you? Juliette met his gaze then, something raw in her expression. Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be chosen for me, not for my last name. Not for what I could offer, just me. Callum's jaw tightened. He understood that more than he wanted to admit. Before he could respond, Ryder stirred inside, shifting on the couch. Callum glanced through the window, then back at Juliette. I should get him home, he said. Juliette nodded, stepping aside as he moved to gather Ryder up in his arms. But before he left, he hesitated at the door. I don't care about your last name, he said, his voice quieter than before. Whatever you left behind. It doesn't change who you are here. Juliette's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something, but in the end, she just gave him a small nod. Callum carried Ryder to the truck, his mind turning over everything she'd told him. He'd thought she was running from something. But now he realized she was running toward something. And maybe, just maybe, that something was him. Callum had never been a man to dwell on things. He fixed what needed fixing, handled what needed handling, and moved on. But Juliette Monroe had settled into his thoughts and refused to leave. Days passed, and she remained woven into his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was there at baseball practices, at the diner when he and Ryder stopped in for dinner, and on her porch in the evenings when he passed by on his way home. And the more time he spent with her, the more he realized she wasn't just another person passing through town. She belonged here in a way neither of them had expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Callum found himself back on Juliette's porch. Ryder was inside, flipping through a book she'd lent him, leaving the two of them alone under the soft glow of the porch light. You ever think about going back? Callum asked, watching as she traced a finger along the wooden railing. Juliette exhaled slowly. To my old life, he nodded. She shook her head. No, I don't miss it. Callum studied her face, the way her expression softened as she looked out at the quiet street. But does it miss you? Her lips pressed together. My family does. Or at least they miss the version of me they expected. Callum tilted his head slightly. And what version is that? Juliette hesitated. The one who followed the rules, who married the right man, attended the right events, and stayed in line. Callum's jaw tightened. There was a man, she gave a small nod. An arrangement more than anything, a man my parents approved of, someone who fit into their world perfectly. He didn't like the way that sounded, didn't like the idea of her being forced into something that wasn't real. What happened? He asked. Juliette turned to face him fully. I left before it could happen. He wasn't a bad man, just the wrong one, and I realized if I didn't walk away, I'd wake up one day living a life I didn't recognize. Callum let that sink in. He understood what it meant to make a choice that changed everything. Juliette sighed, folding her arms across her chest. My parents still think I'll come back eventually, that I'll realize I made a mistake. Callum met her gaze. Did you? She shook her head, her voice steady. No, something in his chest tightened at that. Juliette looked at him carefully. Does it bother you that I come from that world? Callum didn't hesitate. No, what matters to me is the world you're building here. For a moment, she simply stared at him, something shifting in her expression. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he reached for her hand. Her fingers curled around his, warm and steady. "I don't know where this goes," Callum admitted, "but I know I don't want you to leave." Juliette's grip tightened. "I don't want to leave." And just like that, something settled between them, unspoken but understood. Weeks passed, and Callum found himself falling into something he hadn't expected. Juliette fit into his life seamlessly, with Ryder, with the town with him. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted. Callum was working on a house renovation when he saw the unfamiliar car pull up outside Juliette's house. A sleek, black vehicle, polished to perfection, with a man stepping out who didn't belong in their town. Instinct tightened in Callum's gut. He wiped his hands on his jeans and made his way over. Juliette was already on her porch, arms crossed as she faced the man. "Juliette," the man said, his tone smooth, practiced, "you've been ignoring my calls." Callum stepped closer. "Is there a problem here?" The man turned, his gaze sweeping over him before returning to Juliette. "And who is this?" Juliette's expression didn't waver. "Callum." The man studied him for a moment before offering a tight smile. "I'm Charles, Juliette's fiancé." The words landed like a punch. Callum's jaw clenched. Juliette exhaled sharply. "Ex-fiancé," she corrected. Callum didn't miss the flicker of irritation in the man's expression. Charles took a step closer. "Your parents sent me. They want you to come home." Callum felt the tension rolling off her as she straightened her shoulders. "I am home," Charles scoffed. "This isn't your life, Juliette. You're playing house in a town that doesn't even know who you are." Callum took a step forward. "She knows who she is." Charles barely spared him a glance. "And what exactly do you think you are to her?" Juliette moved before Callum could respond. She stepped between them, her voice firm. "You don't get to come here and decide what my life should be." Charles exhaled sharply. "Fine. But don't expect them to wait forever. Sooner or later, you'll realize you don't belong here." Juliette's eyes flashed. "I already realized where I belong, and it isn't with you." Charles studied her for a moment, then shook his head before turning back to his car. When he drove off, Juliette let out a slow breath. Callum finally spoke. "You all right?" She turned to him, her eyes steady. "I know what I want." Callum stepped closer. "And what's that?" Her voice didn't waver. "You." The words hit him like a force, solid and real. Callum reached for her, his hand sliding against her cheek as she leaned into him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. For the first time in a long time, Juliette looked like she truly believed it. Months passed, and their lives intertwined in ways neither of them had planned, but neither of them wanted to change. Callum knew he couldn't let her go. And one evening, as they stood on her porch, he pulled a small box from his pocket. Juliette's breath hitched as he opened it, revealing the simple but elegant ring inside. "I never expected you," Callum admitted. "But now I can't imagine my life without you." Juliette's eyes filled with emotion. "Callum." He took her hand, his voice steady. "Marry me." A tear slipped down her cheek as she nodded. "Yes." The word came out as a whisper, but it was the only answer he needed. Their wedding was small but perfect, surrounded by the people who had become their family. Ryder stood beside Callum, grinning as Juliette walked down the aisle, radiant and sure. And when Callum kissed his wife for the first time, he knew without a doubt that she had been right all along. Home wasn't a place. It was the people you chose, and he had chosen her.